Everyone, this video is about the female reproductive cycle. The events that occur during the female reproductive cycle involve hormones from the hypothalamus, from the anterior pituitary gland, and from the ovary. So if we look first at this schematic describing how, for both males and females, the activity of the testis or ovary is controlled. In both cases, you have a hormone from the hypothalamus called gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and we'll just call it GnRH. In some contexts, it's called LHRH. That hormone goes to the anterior pituitary gland, traveling only in this short portal system between the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and stimulates the release of both LH, or luteinizing hormone, and FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone. With all three of these hormones, most commonly we use the acronym rather than the full name. Of course, it's shorter to say, but also these two hormones, LH and FSH, the name is a bit historical and archaic and doesn't tell you that much about the function of the hormone. These two hormones both act on the testis or ovary. LH has the primary job of stimulating the production of sex steroid hormones in the testis or in the ovary. And FSH has the primary job of stimulating the production of eggs or sperm. So the reason why there are two hormones stimulated by GnRH is because there are two jobs that have to be accomplished by the gonad, the testis, or the ovary. So each of those two jobs has a primary controller from the anterior pituitary. These sex steroid hormones that are triggered to be produced or released by LH then feedback negatively on the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So it's stimulation on the way down. The more GnRH you have, the more LH and FSH you'll have. The more LH and FSH you have, the more sex steroid hormones you have, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. And the more estrogen and testosterone you have, the less GnRH and LH and FSH, respectively, that are released. So it's a classic negative feedback loop that's typical of these systems in endocrinology. Okay, so now if we just focus on the female, then you still have GnRH and you still have LH and FSH, but now we're just going to talk about estrogen and progesterone specifically here, and then the production of eggs. So again, LH is going to have a primary role. You'll see it's more complex, but a primary role of stimulating estrogen and progesterone production. And FSH has the primary role of stimulating the development of eggs. So almost all textbooks about physiology have a figure that is something like this. And in order to understand what these types of figures convey, you have to look at the different levels, all right? So here we have the levels of LH and FSH. So these are things that are being released from the anterior pituitary gland. Some textbooks also show the release of GnRH from the hypothalamus, which is one level higher. Then in the next panel here, we have what's happening in the ovary. First, what's happening, remember the ovary has two things going on. It's making hormones and it's making eggs. So here's the eggs that are developing, and then here are the changing hormones. So again, primarily this row is going to be the responsibility of FSH, and this row is going to be the responsibility of LH. But as you'll see, it gets complicated. Then down here, we have what's happening in the uterus. So pituitary, what's happening in the ovary, and then what's happening in the uterus. Some figures also have things like the basal body temperature change over the cycle. But we're not going to deal with that primarily now. All right, so there are 28 days in menstrual cycles in books. Actual mileage may vary here, but we're going to pretend that all cycles are 28 days long. And day 0, by definition, is the first day of the woman's menstrual period. And the reason why we call that day 0 is because that's the only day that can be reliably identified, right? If you aren't having your menstrual period, then you don't know what day of the cycle you're in unless you count back to that day. Okay, so what's happening at the beginning of a cycle? So it's a cycle, right? So we can start it anywhere, but we're going to start it at day 0. So what's happening now in a way is that the body has given up on becoming pregnant during the previous cycle. And so it's starting a new development cycle of eggs with the hope, in the physiological sense, the attempt to release an egg and potentially have it be fertilized to produce an embryo. Okay, so at the beginning of the cycle, you see that LH and FSH levels are not zero, that would be down here, but relatively low, steady release. The negative feedback loop keeps their levels steady. Okay, so relatively low but steady levels of LH and FSH. And then remember, FSH's job is to stimulate the development of eggs. So during this time in the cycle, eggs are developing, and they begin to form these follicles. So a follicle is the egg itself, and then these supporting cells around it that help provide nutrients to it, protect it, and so on as it develops. Because these follicles are really the most important thing that's going on in the ovary, this whole half of the cycle is called the follicular phase, the phase of developing eggs. Okay, so these eggs are developing, and you can see that at the very beginning here, estrogen and progesterone are also very low. And there's a third hormone we're not going to talk about too much here called inhibin. Inhibin exists in order to allow the possibility of decoupling LH and FSH. It selectively inhibits FSH. Okay, so estrogen and progesterone are pretty low here, but these follicle cells, not the egg itself, but these follicle cells, as they develop, produce estrogen and a little bit of progesterone, but not much. So you can see that the estrogen level rises as these follicles become more developed and closer to the stage at which an egg might be able to be ovulated. Now, an ovary is only going to ovulate one egg typically in a cycle, but many eggs start to develop. Maybe 40, maybe 50 in a given cycle are at this pretty advanced stage of development. So those are developing. The supporting cells are releasing more and more estrogen. And meanwhile, in the uterus, the uterine lining has been shed. And then under the stimulation of estrogen, it begins to rebuild itself. So this rising level of estrogen causes the what's called the proliferative phase, as labeled here in the uterus, which means the cells in the uterus start to in the uterine lining, the endometrium, start to proliferate. Okay, so all this is happening. All the eggs are developing and producing estrogen and so on. And then we have this key moment in the middle of the cycle. What needs to happen is a big change. We need to have the release of the egg from the follicle, and in fact from the ovary. So the egg actually sort of pops off the surface of the ovary into the peritoneal cavity, where eventually the fimbriae of the fallopian or uterine tube gather it up. So whenever you need a big change in physiology, what you need is a positive feedback loop. But what we have here is a negative feedback loop, right? The more GnRH you have, the more LH you have, the more estrogen you have, the less GnRH you have. So the way this works is that in order to get this big change, this whole system, the one that we were talking about before here, where GnRH stimulates LH, stimulates estrogen, and estrogen inhibits GnRH, is actually going to become a positive feedback loop for a short period of time. In a woman, it's only between 24 and 48 hours that you have this positive feedback loop. And so what I mean is, GnRH will continue to stimulate LH, which continues to stimulate estrogen, but now estrogen's effect on GnRH is to stimulate it. So the more GnRH you have, the more LH, the more estrogen, the more GnRH, the more LH, the more estrogen. So this snowballs, right? Until you have a surge of really all three of these hormones, a huge change. You can't see GnRH on this figure, but you can see the huge surge in LH. And that is the switch to positive feedback is triggered by this fast increase in estrogen at the end of the follicular phase. This rapid change in estrogen level triggers a change in the neurons that release GnRH to respond then positively to estrogen. And so you get this huge change in LH. You'll notice you don't get a huge change in FSH, and that's because inhibin has temporarily increased its release, because we don't need a surge in FSH here. We just need this big surge in LH. Why do we need it? Because this surge in LH, as it's called, is the trigger for ovulation. So you see here what's happening in the ovary. As soon as you get that LH surge, you have structural changes in the cytoskeleton of the follicle that cause the egg to be released. That's the end of the follicular phase. So during that phase, what happened? We grew up a bunch of eggs. The biggest one won and got ovulated, and we made a lot of estrogen from the cells that were supporting those eggs. Now we have the second half of the cycle, which is the luteal phase. You'll see that the LH level quickly drops back down to its normal level, and same with FSH. Now we have a different hormonal situation. So we know that LH can stimulate the production of sex steroid hormones, right? And it stimulates mainly estrogen production in the follicular phase. But in the luteal phase, it stimulates primarily progesterone production. So we can see here that estrogen was high during the follicular phase, but then it begins to drop down and stays at a somewhat lower range during the luteal phase. Whereas progesterone, which was hardly released at all during the follicular phase, now begins its huge release and its action, as we'll see. Where does this progesterone come from? From these cells that are left over from the follicle. So the follicle released its egg, but the follicle cells are still there. And what are those cells? They're cells stuffed with cholesterol, because cholesterol is the basis for all steroid hormones. Those cells were using that cholesterol to make estrogen, but now they're going to use that cholesterol to make progesterone. And these leftover cells are called the corpus luteum, or sometimes just CL. All right? So the corpus luteum secretes progesterone. The progesterone level goes up, and that progesterone maintains the uterine lining. The uterine lining cannot be maintained in the absence of progesterone. So progesterone is maintaining the uterine lining, and the purpose of this part of the cycle, this luteal phase of the cycle named after the corpus luteum, is to maintain the uterus in a state that if that egg that got released at mid-cycle is fertilized, it will have a place to implant and develop. After 14 days, either that will have happened, the embryo will have, if the egg gets fertilized and the embryo survives and implants in the uterus, and in that case, there will be what's called a rescue of the corpus luteum. There'll be a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin in humans, and chorionic gonadotropin in other mammals, that allows the corpus luteum to keep making progesterone until the placenta can take over that task. If that doesn't happen, then the corpus luteum doesn't live very long. Those cells are not really intended to live long lives. They don't have a lot of housekeeping activities, and they're just going to die after a couple of weeks. So as they die, the progesterone level drops, and the progesterone level dropping is the trigger for menstruation to begin, the menstrual period to begin, and the cycle begins anew. All right, so those are the phases of the cycle. The way you want to think of it is, at the beginning, the first half of the cycle, we're growing up eggs, all right? And in the second half of the cycle, we're protecting the uterus in case of a possible pregnancy. If you have questions about that, let me know.